The myth that boys can't be sexually used or abused, and if one is, he can never be a real man.
This myth implies that a boy who has been sexually used or abused will never be a real man. Our society expects males to be able to protect themselves.
Successful men are depicted as never being vulnerable, either physically or emotionally.
Whether you agree with that definition of masculinity or not,
Boys are not men, they are children.
They are weaker and more vulnerable than those who sexually abuse or exploit them,
Who use their greater size, strength, and knowledge
to manipulate or coerce boys into unwanted sexual experiences and staying silent.
This is usually done from a position of authority,
Coach,
teacher,
religious leader,
or status, like an older cousin, admired athlete, or social leader.
using whatever means are available to reduce resistance, such as attention, special privileges, money or other gifts.
Promises or bribes, even outright threats.
What happens to any of us as children does not need to define us as adults or men. It is important to remember that
1 in 6 boys are sexually abused before age 18, and that those boys can grow up to be strong,
powerful,
courageous,
and healthy men.
If a boy experienced sexual arousal during abuse, he wanted or enjoyed it. And if he partly wanted the sexual experience, then it was his fault.
Many boys and men believe this myth and feel lots of guilt and shame because they got physically aroused during the abuse. It is important to understand that males can respond to sexual stimulation with an erection or even an orgasm, even in sexual situations that are traumatic or painful. That's just how the male bodies and brains work. Those who sexually use and abuse boys know this. They often attempt to maintain secrecy and to keep the abuse going by telling the child that his sexual response shows he was a willing participant and complicit in the abuse.
But that doesn't make it true. Boys are not seeking to be sexually abused or exploited. They can, however, be manipulated into experiences they do not like or even understand at the time.
There are many situations where a boy, after being gradually manipulated with attention, affection, and gifts, feels like he wants such attention and sexual experience. The attention and pleasure of sexual contact with someone the boy admires can feel good.
But in reality, it's still about a boy who's vulnerable to manipulation. It's still about a boy who's betrayed by someone who selfishly exploited the boy's needs for attention and affection to use him sexually.
Myth 3. The myth that sexual abuse is less harmful to boys than girls.
Most studies show that the long-term effects of sexual abuse can be quite damaging for both males and females.
One large study conducted by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control found that the sexual abuse of boys was more likely to involve penetration of some kind, which is associated with greater psychological harm.
The harm caused by sexual abuse mostly depends on things not determined by gender, including the abuser's identity, the duration of the abuse, whether the child told anyone at the time, and if so, whether the child was believed and helped.
Many boys suffer harm because adults who could believe them and help are reluctant.
Or refuse to acknowledge what happened and the harm it caused.
This increases the harm, especially the shame felt by boys and men, and leads many to believe that they have to tough it out on their own.
And that, of course, makes it harder to seek needed help in the midst of abuse,
or even years later when help is still needed.
The myth that most men who sexually abuse boys are gay.
Studies about this question suggest that men who have sexually abused a boy most often identify as heterosexual and often are involved in adult heterosexual relationships at the time of abusive interaction. There is no indication that a gay man is more likely to engage in sexually abusive behavior than a straight man, and some studies even suggest it is less likely. The sexual abuse is not a sexual relationship. It's an assault. The sexual orientation of the abusive person is not really relevant to the abusive interaction. A man who sexually abuses or exploits boys is not engaging in a homosexual interaction, any more then men who sexually abuse or exploit girls are engaging in heterosexual behavior. He is a deeply confused individual who, for various reasons, desires to sexually use or abuse a child and has acted on that desire.
Number 5 for Denim Day. The myth that boys abused by males must have attracted the abuse because they are gay, or they become gay as a result of the sexual abuse.
There are different theories about how sexual orientation develops, but experts in human sexuality do not believe that sexual abuse or premature sexual experiences play a significant role.
There is no good evidence that someone can make another person be homosexual or heterosexual.
Sexual orientation is a complex issue, and there is no single answer or theory that explains why someone identifies himself as homosexual, heterosexual, or bisexual.
It is common, however, for boys and men who have been abused to express confusion about their sexual identity and orientation, whether they identify as straight, gay, or bisexual. Some guys who identify as homosexual fear that due to their experiences as boys, they must really be homosexual.
Even men who clearly identify as heterosexual, and men who project very traditional heterosexual traits, may fear that others will find them out as gay or not real men. Men who identify as gay or bisexual may wonder if their sexual orientation was influenced in a way by the abusive experience, or may even be the cause of their orientation.
Also, many boys abused by males wonder if something about them sexually attracted the person who abused them
and will unknowingly attract other males who will misuse them. While these are understandable fears, they are not true.
One of the greatest tragedies of childhood sexual abuse is how it robs a person natural rights to discover his own sexuality in his own time.
It is very important to remember that abuse arises from the abusive person's failure to develop and maintain healthy adult sexual relationships, and his willingness to sexually use and abuse kids. It has nothing to do with the preferences or desires of the child who is abused, and therefore cannot determine a person's natural sexual identity.
Myth 6.
The myth that if a female used or abused a boy,
He was lucky.
and if he doesn't feel that way,
Then there's something wrong with him. Comes from the image of masculinity that boys learn very early. It says not only that males can't be sexually abused, but that any sexual experience with girls and women, especially older, is evidence that he's a real man.
the confusion comes from focusing on sexual aspects rather than the abusive ones.
The exploitation and betrayal by a more powerful, trusted, or admired person who can be a child or adult. In reality, premature, coerced, or otherwise abusive or exploitive sexual experiences are never positive.
Whether they are exposed by an older sister, sister of a friend,
Babysitter, neighbor, aunt,
mother, or any female in that position of power over a boy.
at a minimum, they cause confusion and insecurity. They almost always harm boys and men's capacity for trust and intimacy.
Being sexually used or abused, whether by males or females, can cause a variety of other emotional and psychological problems.
However, boys and men often don't recognize the connections between what happened and their later problems. To be used as a sexual object by a more powerful person, male or female, is never a good thing and can cause lasting harm. Myth 6.
Myth 7. The myth that boys who are sexually abused will go on to abuse others.
This myth is especially dangerous because it can create terrible fear in boys and men.
They may not only fear becoming abusers themselves,
but that others will find out they were abused and believe that they are a danger to children.
Sadly, boys and men who tell of being sexually abused often are viewed more as potential perpetrators than as guys who need support.
While it is true that many though by no means all,
who are sexually abused children have histories of sexual abuse. It is not true that most boys who are sexually abused go on to sexually abuse others.
The majority of boys do not go on to become sexually abusive as adolescents or adults.
If they get the help when they are young, usually they don't abuse children when they become adults.